general store. Well, we'll start with what it looks somewhat like today. And this is a picture of downtown Jenison, probably about 1968, 9, somewhere. Well, maybe a little after the 1970, because this is the Kmart building just beginning to take shape. And McDonald's had already come into its own. McDonald's is in kind of an interesting place because it was it was the only McDonald's not open on Sunday. And that, for a few years, stayed until Meyer built, and Meyer wanted to be open on Sunday, and so when the township allowed that, then McDonald's now is 7 days a week. You can see the Rush Creek here, and this intersection coming after the expressway was built. And this is the old bank, Union Bank, and it was replaced by
Curious World
Pets. Yes. Behind that is a restaurant that most people don't remember, but it was the Satellite Restaurant, and you could buy moon burgers there. And across the street from where the bank was, and we might mention that it wasn't always a bank, it was the site of the Jenison Mill. And here you can see Muffler Man, but that's the site of the Jenison store. We'll talk more about that later. And then a business plaza here that had a number of different stores in it. And today, Orkin is there. Excuse me.
Now, right between where the Orkin is and where the Muffler Man, that little black strip there, is where the original main street was. Right through there. That's where the original main street was before the expressway came in. The reason they said that they moved it was because of the off-ramp. They said that people could not decelerate quick enough to turn onto Main Street from the off-ramp, so they moved it about 150 yards to the west to allow people to slow down and get stopped before making the turn onto Main Street into Baldwin and stuff.
And with a small jog from Main Street, that continued right out to Chicago Drive before the expressway. But at the end of that little spot, just behind Muffler Man, yet today is a road closed sign because of that change in direction. And this big curve was put in so that people could come to this intersection to get out of town. Moving on, this is the Christian school. Gene, what's going on there?
Well, that's the Christian school, which became, when the Christian schools moved out, there were several businesses there. There was an insurance business there and a couple other ones. The reason that they sold it, we don't really know, although they're kind of landlocked there. They didn't have much room for a playground, etc. And they didn't own the property across the street, which is where we used to play ball as little kids. You know, the supposedly the lower L would play the ball games over there, and the upper L would play on the other side over in that area. And they were kind of landlocked, so they, after a period of time, they moved it out on top of the hill up by 20th and Baldwin in that area.
Now, this Christian school actually started as the Congregational Church, and through a series of modernizations, the wooden Congregational Church disappeared, and we end up with this long 1950s style school. And then we have First Church right here, and it's face is on Baldwin. And this is the back part of it. And then there are a number of residences along what we used to call Old Baldwin,
Or originally it was known as the Grand Haven Road, way back.
because it came out of Granville, up and over the railroad track, and then headed west. And speaking of the railroad track, here is the original and still the right-of-way for the railroad. And this building right here, what was that?
That was the Farm Bureau egg processing plant. That was built in the early 60s. And it was consumed by fire on Christmas Eve. And I forgot the exact year, but it was in the early 70s, I believe, when that was destroyed by fire. And then just opposite that, you had a little place that was an insurance agency. And I think now it's a real estate agency. And then you had, in between that and the Muffler Man, or not the Muffler Man, but the other little plaza there, which originally started out as Rhonda Tire Retread Shop. And then it was torn down, and there's several businesses there. And then Fables came in between them, and then it was sold to Perkins. Yeah. And now it's home of Tommy's Car Wash. Now, if you look towards the top, right center, you can see a line in the snow where you would go down to get to the old river crossing, the old barge river crossing. That was called River Avenue. That's where you would go to cross before the bridge was built by Johnson Park. If you wanted to go to Standale, that's how you would get across.
And the old Jenison sawmill was located here in the trees, just off of River Avenue. And the Jenison Ferry in 1908, I believe, was established, and that allowed people from Talmadge Township to come over to Jenison and Granville to do their shopping and also to go to church. And that was a very popular way to get across for the people of Talmadge. As a matter of fact, they had to petition to get the some of the pilings out of the river. The pilings were there to make a channel for the river boats, but to get them removed so that the ferry could go all the way across. I noticed some fields here. These are farm fields?
Those are old farm fields, yes.
And you know this area quite well.
Well, that's where we used to summer graze our cattle from the Blissfelt farms, and we would be able to take from the Blissfelt farms, which are on about halfway between Main Street here in Jenison and Sunnybrook Golf Course. We were able to chase them underneath the bridges, underneath the old M21, the new M21, and the railroad bridge. We were able to chase them underneath those bridges to that area, and they would summer graze there all summer.
Ah.
And part of that is now where the Granville sewage plant is. That was also part of the summer grazing.
So there's the downtown area, but we can move on. Here's another picture of that area that Gene was just talking about, the Blissville Farm, which was about right here?
Right there. Yep.
Okay, and so those cows could wander in the pasture close to the barn, but in the summer you would drive them across. And yes, Chicago Drive, under Chicago Drive.
That would be what we called the new Chicago Drive. The old Chicago Drive went right along,
Here's the end of it.
There's the end of it, and it followed right along the railroad till you get to where the miniature golf course is, the on-ramp to southbound or westbound 196.
Notice this pond here.
That is Rosewood Lake, I guess they call it. That's where the senior center is up there. And that dirt that they dug out of there was used to build the highway, the freeway between Chicago Drive and Wilson 28th Street area there.
Okay, and
that the white line there is the path that the earth movers took to get to place the dirt, unload the dirt. And they had a flagman on Chicago Drive that would stop traffic. I mean, these guys had the right of way. The only thing they couldn't stop was the trains. The trains still had the right of way, but all traffic had to stop for these, and there was a lot of them. I mean, they went from early in the morning until I think they went from 7 in the morning until 11 at night. And they were constant for about 6 months.
And if you can imagine now, here is the way the expressway began back in the day, in the 60s, here with this one clover leaf, but if you look today, you find this really tall earthwork, and that's where all the dirt came from in order to build and extend the expressway to Holland. And also this area became a large lake as well, Kennewick Lake, to continue it until they got to higher ground.
But you can see this area right in here where the arrow is now was all part of the Blissfeld farm. There was at one time over 600 acres. It went all the way from some on the east side of Port Sheldon, all the way to 8th Avenue at the top. And everything basically on, well, at the end of 8th Avenue there, it went to Rush Creek to the south, and then it went straight east to Port Sheldon.
So that was the Blissfeld farm.
And this was the farm of Mr. Ben Hanchett, who owned and was president of the Grand Rapids, in the Grand Rapids, Holland in Urban, or Electric Railroad, or, you know, it was defined by a couple of different names.
And the Blissfeld farm was established by a Nelson Bliss, who married one of the Jenison girls, and Bliss plus Veld, which is field or farm in Dutch. That's where the name came from, and that was one of the up-and-coming farms of the area. And here's another aerial photograph of downtown Jenison, about 1973 or so.
Looking west.
Looking west on Baldwin, and you can see already that Baldwin had become a 5-lane road, and Cottonwood is even wider today. But here's the Meyer parking lot, which helps us date this to somewhere after the 1970s, before a lot of the outbuildings came to be as they are today. This was what, the Kroger grocery store?
Kroger grocery store. And then you had over there, you had Pros 5 and Dime.
This was a plaza.
Jergens and the whole floor, had a store there. And it used to be a sagebrush store that was in front of several Meyer stores. There was a sagebrush store.
Mm-hmm.
And the way at the top was started out as a bank right in there.
Is that Old Kent Bank?
I don't know. It's changed names a couple of different times.
Okay.
And then the one thing that kind of sticks out at you is like a racetrack. Well, this is where the Jenison had a rodeo. And this was a brainchild of Mr. Carl Moody, who had his fingers dabbled in a lot of stuff. He owned some racehorses. He was a big hunter up in UP early on. And he owned that gas station on the corner there where DeWitt's service is now. So where DeWitt's was, it's gone now, there was always a gas station or a car fix-it shop. In the early years, he just sold gas, but later on, then he kind of phased out of the gas business and only fixed cars. That was his dream, was that rodeo that held.
That's Carl Moody's dream.
Carl Moody's dream, and that that appeared now. I don't really know what's there now. I think there's a bank, big 2-story bank building there now, but that's where the racetrack was, and to the right of where the racetrack is, kind of an open field where people could park and stuff like that. And they had other events there, but most people don't realize that they did have a rodeo here in Jenison.
And over here is it's not Sunset, it's at New Amsterdam Village.
Amsterdam Village.
And this was our first apartment
complex,
and it has survived yet today. There are a lot of buildings, homes there for people to live in, and Sunset Manor was here established, and this is much smaller than it is today.
It's more than double that size now.
Yes, along with Maplewood School, which came to Jenison in the 60s. or late 50s, I should say.
Now, Maplewood was the first expansion type school. In the mid-50s, the smaller schools in Jenison combined with what they called Georgetown Consolidated, which became Bowerwood. And this was the first one after they consolidated the schools. This area here began to develop in the mid-50s, and they had the need for another school, so they built this one here as the first one. You know, first of, I think, 5 of them now that are elementary schools.
And this area along Baldwin was the first to develop as a
Right.
residential area.
Right.
And you can find some, especially on the north side of Baldwin, some of the older, smaller homes
Right, and this was,
that were the style of the 50s and 60s.
and this was the Northouse family that owned this, and that's the names Hazel and Sally. And then on the south side you had Pete, which is Pete Northouse. He was a doctor in Grand Rapids who actually delivered me. He was an obstetrician. And then you have the little lake there that one of the first farms there that they developed that to dig gravel. This was one of the first ventures into digging gravel in the Jenison area. Now, there's several of them since, but this was the first one.
Now, because of the river and the lowlands all had to be drained, and you can see evidence of these drains that kept the water levels lower so that basements could go in, and we didn't have to deal with a lot of flooding except from the big river.
Right, now my grandpa used to call this the Watson Drain. It went through Mr. Watson's property, and it was on the back side of my grandfather's property, which is now Maplewood Lake, and that drained Maplewood Lake and the mucks in that area.
Right up in here.
North of Bower Road and stuff, that all went to the river through another creek, but this drained the muck there. On the south end of the muck by Rosewood, they call that the Houseman Drain, and that drained into Rush Creek. And where the two were divided, I don't know. I think it's in the area of Baldwin where the Watson Drain went to the north and the Houseman Drain went to the south. But that was when the Dutch came and started draining the swamps.
And then it could be used for farmland, and is yet today, much of it. I notice a small U-shaped building here. Seems to me House of Flavors.
House of Flavors, and there was a donut shop, a coffee shop with a donut, they made donuts there. Yes, that was a
hot spot.
That was a hot spot. That was actually started by the Lowing family. It's kind of an offshoot of their dairy. They kind of opened this House of Flavors. I think later on it was bought out by a chain, but anyway, that's where it kind of got started.
I noticed some apartment buildings had begun to materialize here. And let's see, here's the Jenison Farmers Market. And gas station there on the corner of the end of Cottonwood. That would be School Street before they changed it.
Changed it to Cottonwood all the way through into, actually Cottonwood extends now all the way to Port Sheldon.
Okay, we'll move on. Early stores. Well, it depends on how you define a store, but one of the earliest would have been the mill and, of course, the general store on the map. And here, of course, is the museum, so it's just over Rush Creek to the general store. In the mill, after the mill was sold to Zoe and Clarence Tiffany, who actually bought the museum as well from Bessie Hanchett. Zoe had an antique shop, and so the mill, which had stopped grinding grain in the 40s, she established that and kept it going until the highway department bought this whole block for the on and off ramp. Here's a drawing of what old Jenison could look like. And here's the mill, along with the steam engine that ran the mill.
Actually, the mill went through 3 phases. At its very beginning, it was water powered. They had a little dam there that they ran with water power. Then it was to steam, and later on it was a diesel powered outfit.
And the belts to run all the machinery came up out of the basement, I
Out of the
believe.
basement all the way up to the top. And then, you know, the grain would go up to the top, and through a series of pipes and stuff, it would channel down to the area that it had to go. And they kind of separated it between wheat and oats and rye and corn in the several different little bins that they would make sure that you know, the wheat didn't get mixed with the corn, etc. And this mill, as Ken mentioned earlier, the people from the Standell area would come across on that barge because this mill was the only mill in the area that could grind it fine enough for regular flour. A lot of the mills that you see in the area were just ground feed, you know, for animal feed, but this one here actually ground it fine enough for flour.
The general store just across the street, and then the Oler Brothers store. And you can see down Main Street to the Congregational Church, and then at the corner of Main and Baldwin, the First Christian Reformed Church. Now this brick block was an apartment building.
That was the first apartment in Jenison.
And that's where Lumen Jenison lived for a time, and then other renters. But later, it became a garden shop, I believe.
Garden center or whatever.
Garden
Yeah.
center, and this building was taken down and another one put in its place. Private residence, and then the train depot was here on Mill Street. This was Mill Street that ran into Baldwin. Then you could take Baldwin east to get up and over the railroad track and into Granville. Just down from the depot was the veterinary shop.
A little complex of businesses.
Yeah, and just next to it was the saloon. And at the end of Mill Street, facing Baldwin, was a creamery where you could take your milk to get separated for butter and other good things, and the blacksmith shop. Here in, also along Mill Street was the hotel, and this was one of the last of the commercial buildings of Jenison to be taken down.
The Jenison, you know, center, as it were, from the 1800s.
In the foreground, we have the interurban that came out of Granville, starting in Grand Rapids, came to Granville through Jenison out to Jamestown, and then to Zeeland and on to the end of Lake Macatawa. But here are the two buildings. This one is the passenger station, and across the double tracks would be the freight station. Oh, the mail is getting delivered here. Closter House, I think, was the deliverer. Headed out to Kennewa and then south. This was the Piers home, J.J. Piers. It came with his job as a manager for
Business manager.
yeah, for Ben Hanchett, and JJ would also be in charge of the mill and the store and all of the rental properties, and continued in that job, but the house actually came with the job.
Now, going back to your guy with the little mail delivery there, in the old days, the post office would change when you had a change of president between the Oler brothers, who would have it when I think it was the Democrats were in power, and then when the Republicans were in power, that went over to the L&L Jenison store, and that's the way they operated the post office in those days.
Now, the post office was simply the cubby holes
Yes.
and a window that could be picked up and moved over. This is part of the legends
Yeah.
of Jenison.
Eventually, they added a little addition on the side of the L&L Jenison store, and that's where it became permanent after they got through feuding over, you know, where it should be.
So from the drawing to an actual collage photograph, showing that same scene with the mill and the Jenison General Store, company store.
This was before the post office was added.
Yeah, and here you can, if you remember that, when we see some later pictures, you'll catch that. There's Old Brothers and the brick block apartment building, and then here at the end of Mill Street was the blacksmith shop, and of course the railroad grade came right through there, and you can see the wagon that was used to deliver coal, which was dropped off behind the Jenison store, and then it had to be wagon loaded over to the steam engine. But there, parked in front of the general store, is an early automobile.
An old Model T. Now, right in the front of the old Model T, it's actually not in front, but was the flowing well.
Right
It looks
here.
like it's right in front of the car. It's actually not. It's closer to where the photographer of this was taken. But anyway, that flowing well stood for many, many years, and it got pump stolen a couple of times. But it finally ended, I think, basically when the highway department changed all that. Is when they kind of ended that flowing well.
Artesian well, and people in the early days, even up into the 40s, would stop there for a little refreshment.
Supposedly some of the best water around. And people would come with jugs and take it home.
But then they found that the water got polluted, and so they had to cap it off. Now, okay, this is a later photograph. This is Main Street coming between the general store and the Oler Brothers store, and we're thinking that it's somewhere around Christmas time. But you get a flavor of winters here in Jenison, and I see that they don't have a lot of insulation
No, not much
on the
insulation.
roof. So here's the general store from the 40s, and we'll talk more about the Old Brothers store later, but it did change. This is interesting because we have 1, 2, 3 steps up, but to modernize, they actually dropped the entire building down to the ground level so that people could more easily go into the store. To do that, they had to jack the whole thing up and then lower it. Here you can see on the side of the building that post office that was added, and then it's the building's demise as they tore everything down.
This was probably its demise was about 64 or 63 or 64, somewhere in that area. Isn't it?
The Oler Brothers store across the street went through a number of changes. Here you can see the Oler Brothers, it's like early construction with buggies and so on. But later it got all painted. We have a scale here on the side.
The scale was used to weigh the coal as they would deliver it. They had to, they bought it by the ton, and they would weigh it there at that scale.
And this is one of my favorite photographs of the Oler Brothers store with a 1920s vintage roadster heading out to the lake, perhaps. And there you can see the scale again. But now this was early picture of the Jenison store, but next to it, the Oler Brothers store was torn down, and a new
Brick building.
this party store is really early party store.
Yeah.
And it was known as the Jenison Fuel and Grocery, but locally it was known as Johnny's store.
It was named after John Hundred.
And here you can see the inside of it, stocked with all kinds of dry goods as well as a meat market. So, and the Oler Brothers were famous for handing out candy to kids. And today, the Orkin Company has their store in the same place. Here you can see the brick block or apartment building we talked about next to the Oler Brothers, and it became, after the building was torn down, it became the Brookside Mower and Garden Center. And this is all on Mill Street. Here's a picture of the saloon, one of 3 that we have recorded that survived.
This was the last one to survive.
Came down in the 1950s, and that was across the street from the hotel, which in its day, a lot of people could come by train, they could stay there. Also at the end of Mill Street, we talked about the blacksmith shop. Here's an early photograph of the blacksmith shop, and here later on, when it no longer was being used, the building next to it was the creamery, and later became kind of a storage building and garage. Behind the mill was the Andre building, and Mr. Andre was sold insurance.
He was the regional manager for State Farm.
Yeah. And also the post office was located there for a time after the general store came down.
Right.
And to give you a location, this is today the Pile of Rocks, and was the Curious World animal shop. Before that, it was the Union Bank, as you can see, but here's the Satellite Burger sign, and then the Andre building behind it. No?
No.
Not the Andre.
Nope, the Andre building would have been over on this side. This would have been the plaza over here, where the mower shop, and I think the Orkin building was in that shop, in that little strip mall there, they call it. And this is looking basically northeast towards whatever.
Along old M21.
Yes, where that van is parked there, that would have been where old M21, the cement highway, it was referred to by the locals, one of the first cement highways in, around. And it was just a short 2-mile stretch, but that's what it was called.
More modern and closer to our time, of course, 1970 is when the Meyer store came in, and this is an early photograph of the building, which is still there, but it has new facade and has been modernized. Not that it was so unmodern before. This is the intersection of Cottonwood, and this is Riverview Road, and I can see a gas station there on the corner.
That was a Union, started out as Union 76, I believe. Where that's Walgreens is there now.
Yeah. And here's Pros 5 and 10, which was part of the plaza that is still there today. And Jergens and Hofler and a lot of other stores have come and gone from there. And the Gardens shop, and here is the House of Flavors.
House of Flavors, and the donut shop was on one end, the House of Flavors was on the other.
And we mentioned Fables.
Fables.
And here's the early construction of that building, and became a favorite place to eat for a time, and then became Perkins. And speaking of places to get some food, this Chicken Licken was out on Chicago Drive. It started as a grocery store?
Started as Brink's Supermarket. John Brink's owned it. He got misplaced when the divided highway went through Hudsonville. He had a place right there by the red light in Hudsonville and got displaced because of that in the late 40s, and he moved here on Chicago Drive here in Jenison.
And then it became Chicken Licken. Now I think Chicken Licken may still be in business.
There's rumors that it is. It went to Friesland after it burned down.
Yeah, they had a fire here in this building.
Then it went to Friesland, and now I heard reports it's in Door. But I don't know. I don't know about that for sure. But anyway.
Well, I would hope it would be indoor.
Yeah, indoor.